I am going to play a little bit of music, and then I'm going to talk about some of these acts from 1862. Hey, that was not bad. I'll try that again. Oh, yeah, that is pretty dope. Right there in PowerPoint. Let me quit. I'll be there all day messing around with that. All right, let's go. Get a little bit more volume today. Peace, DJ. Evening, Jim. Diving right in, 1861 and 1862 were about some major legislation. So Byron Allen did a good job of bringing awareness to 1860 and the Civil Rights Act by challenging it and having it go all the way up to the Supreme Court. But now here's a little bit of the information about why that time was so crucial. Major legislation from 1861, 1862. We'll find ourselves diving into a few of these acts, which would be the Revenue Act of 1861, the Confiscation Act of 1861. We're going to look a little bit into the Anti-Cooley Act, but only in its connection to the Transcontinental Railroad Act. What up, brother D. Nubian? Taz the Goat, what up, my G? So we're going to start off with a little bit of music, then we're going to jump into these acts, and then we're going to take a hard look at them. For that, I'm going to minimize these extra other screens. All right, man, y'all forgive me if I lose track of the chat for a second. Typically, I would turn it off if I'm giving a lecture. That way I don't get too distracted because the information is really valuable, right? So when you look at some of these other ones, which we'll get into some later series, but the Legal Tender Act of 1862, that's going to be a good one. The one that you'll always hear me refer to is that Homestead Act. Now, if we could ever get them to release the actual data of that Homestead Act, I tell you, that's the most vital piece of legislation that passed. That is the most vital piece of legislation that passed. And we need more of that. We need more Homestead Act type legislation that the B1 or American descendants of slaves can actually benefit from. And we actually need that to be something that we can vote on the ballot. We need that legislation, and we need that shit like immediately. So that's going to be a big one. But the one that we really got to call attention to today, which we're going to build up to, is going to be that Railroad Act. Remember, the Pacific Railroad Act is a good one in July, but that Transcontinental Railroad, as you break down that one, you can find yourselves in depth. You can find yourself watching Netflix series. You can find yourself watching, other episodes and learning things about the immigrants and the Chinese and everything they had to do with anti-Cooley because they were bringing in those immigrants. And to be able to pay for a railroad's construction and to move it from the land, one part to the other, it required some skilled labor. And that skilled labor deserved an earnings from that labor. It deserved an income. And that skilled labor deserved to be African-American freed men. And that's why we're going to have to get into it. The other one that I am a benefit of is that Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. Now that one was good too, because as you see, it has land grants built right into it, and it is one of those foundational pieces of universities and that system of universities. And in the South, that was definitely critical because we know that is where the predominant share of HBCUs are erected, is on land similar from those type of legislature and legislation passed. So that's huge. The major takeaway today is getting a little bit more clarity on some of those major legislation pieces that were referred to in that civil rights bill that Byron Allen brought attention to. We can stop at the Civil Rights War, and we can stop it and have conversations about Reconstruction. But remember, this is the foundational elements, which was the actual political and economic endeavors of the time. This is not for entertainment. This is only for education. So let's get into it. I mean, unless you're actually entertained by this type of information, which I am. And I definitely like to bring them to the conversation with a little bit more intellect and a little bit more facts. Now, that's going to be hard. That's definitely going to be hard because, as you'll notice, when it comes down to actuals and specifics, sometimes they lack in that department. It may exist, but the ability to procure it is not without a heck of a lot of research. So, all right, hope the mic's coming in hot. Let's get into it. First off, we're going to pick up where we left off. Damn, is it going to let me manipulate it? Give me a sec. All right, so this is where we left off. We left off with a conversation about the logical fallacies and different things that folks experience. The last episode or the last show live stream was the Black conservative debate tactics. And I gave you 3 major debate tactics, and there's a list of like 26. And so this was the source, or this is a source on learning about the different debate tactics and different things that people do. I think it's disingenuous to come without facts, which is why I like to jump into it. The first one, no, this shouldn't be the first one. The first one was actually the Revenue Act of 1861. There's a lot of different sources that one could cite from it. The Revenue Act of 1861, you can get them from the Senate.gov, which is probably a good source. Investopedia, I like as a source because oftentimes it has the financial elements that are included, the statutes and stories. I don't know about that one. UShistory.com, don't really know about that one. Fraser, the St. Louis Fed.org. Now, I definitely want to jump into that one, the St. Louis Fed. I thought St. Louis didn't really pop, from my knowledge, until like after African Americans, like way, like, what was it, like music even. So somebody would have to correct me on when African Americans en masse started to populate St. Louis, and then I could probably have that conversation from that lens. But as a part of the Fed, we know the establishment of that central banking system is a legitimate topic. That's a legitimate talking point when you're discussing economics on a national scale. And so you need information that's on a national scale, especially when you're talking to power. You're talking about the millions of folks that you're providing for, or a system that has to account for. And so you need numbers that are in the millions, not just the speculations from the subsections therein. All right. What else we got? Politico got a story about it that they came out with. Now that's the tabloids. If you ask me, like sections like Politico, this is more gossip section, something like what I do here in the Politico or the YouTube space. And so I think a lot of people would probably click on the Politico just because it has that information. Myself, I would be more personally invested in the taxhistory.org. The taxhistory.org. And as you see there, a minor tariff in 1861, that's the way that I would view it as significant, is when you're looking at tariffs, because tariffs can give you actual numbers, dollar values. And so when you're looking at the information, you want it to be quantified. That's what you want. There's a lot of subjective language that just talks about, the freedom of the slaves, and the Confiscation Act is going to be one of the next ones. But what you're really trying to establish there is a dollar figure for the basis of reparations. And you want it to be as accurate as possible. If you have these minor tariffs, then what you also would have is the enforcement of a tariff, which is a direct business name and account. So if you have accounts, then you also have a ledger. And so it's, in a sense, the creation of a data list or a data set that actually speaks to the existence of your ancestors. And when you're having that conversation cross-platform, when you're, or myself, Brother Moses, I frequent a lot of different channels with a lot of different content, predominantly B1 as my source. And it's all levels. I'm talking the Hebrew Israelites to Christian pastors to politicians and such, and the B1 media or Black media outlets as well. And so by having those conversations, it's best if you can find the actual comparative data. Like if you go to the House of Consciousness, shout out Sonetta, you can get folks who can tell you that same information about the lineage and as it passed from geography to geography, location to location and such. and the language they trace it by, the religious context they trace it by, and likewise from the economics lens or an ADOS argument, even a B1 argument or even a macro argument, as you want to look at it, one that just really loves and respects Black people and Black consciousness, Black perspectives, then you would also want to know where your ancestors were when it comes to economics. And that's important, right? There are certain contracts that they're able to find where people weren't always, as they like to call out, on the chain gang. They weren't always a part of that. What was it? I know in modern terminology we call it the prison industrial complex, but in many cases they were contracted labor, assigned a check. Yeah, they were assigned a check. And so just to check it out, I would click here, but instead of checking it out, I know I can be very long-winded. I won't beleaguer the point. I just wanted to make sure that we were providing sources for the context of information that we're bringing. That way people are better informed and they're able to see the truth as they so see it, or they're able to research it as they so see it. But the next one that we see on that agenda is the Confiscation Act. Now, when you think about that, what is confiscation? It is the taking of something, and in this case, it's property. And when you say property, you have to understand that that is the equivalent to people. And those people that it's referring to are our ancestors who were in the South, who were owned by those slave owners, or those owners, those big land owners, property owners in the South. And those folks being confiscated, they were called contraband, according to one source. Contraband. Peace, Sugar B. Peace, Miss Chocolate. Voice of reason. Yeah, I'm just trying to be the voice of reason here. Give them that information. As you also see there, AmericanHistoryUSA.com. Not entirely sure who that is or why they're publishing, but encyclopedia, that was always one when I was getting disciplined. Love the almanacs, love the transcripts, love the maps. That gives you a real location and real specific. So I'm actually going to click that just for the time being to transition into an actual source and see if they have something that we can value add. Encyclopedia.com, that is. Looks like they'll jump into Abraham Lincoln, but I've covered that extensively. Yeah, they're going into the different politics of it. Don't really see much there that is of a value add. Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, Benjamin Wade of Ohio. Okay, good, but keep it moving forward. Talks about, their political leanings, but not the bill itself, actually, how it passed, how many it impacted. That's the information that I find important. The prayer of 20 millions. That's a good way to call it. The New York Tribune. I mean, it's good to see that the New York Tribune was putting out information even then. If you like news articles when you're looking for public for sources and things like that, that'd be a good one to add to the PowerPoint slide there. That's a good source that they dropped, but that's probably all that they actually dropped on this one besides so they got a little bit of numbers here. All proceeds from confiscation by 1867. So you see that went on for a while, amount of $1,000. They failed to pass the law. It was not important because property confiscation was too important. Confiscation debates were significant for the amount of ideological, agonizing, and self-reflection they produced. Oh, and that same author went into it, and he was talking about the fact that it established from the North their debate point that they were using in their debate was that the slaves were human. And that was the humanizing effect, because as you remember in the 50s, they passed the Dred Scott, and the Southern interpretation of Dred Scott was 3/5 of man, meaning that they weren't even a whole human. And so the argument would therein, in this case, this judicial ruling or whatever, this bill was to actually establish the humanity. And again, that was big for me as a moralist, but I'll keep going, or as a sentimentalist. All right, now the big one with the major takeaway, I also see there's a couple of live streams that may be getting ready to kick off, so I won't be too long-winded on this one. Just wanted to bring at least 3 of the major premises that we were referring to. So as you see here, that Transatlantic Slave Trade and Pacific Railway Act pushed all the way to Sacramento, which is why the Cooley Act is important, right? So love the maps. It definitely shows the trail from the south. It definitely shows the reason why they wanted to pull those people up north for the different labor contracts. If you look at some of the images, it shows you some of the construction that needed to happen. So that's definitely a lot of labor. The people building these bridges and roads and laying that track, all of that were good paying jobs and things. And it was also a pathway out of what was considered that slavery. Now that contract was super long and it was just similar or akin to indentured, but at least your name hit a contract roll. And as you'll see in some of these images, if you're interested in finding out more information, there were blacks that were pulled into that. And that's going to be important, right? How did your people make it this far west? And did your people start to make it this far west due to that slave trade? Were they a part, or the transcontinental railroad construction? Were they also a part of any military movements to the west? When did they move west? Did they move back east after they, or move back down south after they finished whatever stretch of highway they worked on? Did they survive? Did they die on that journey? Did they have kids and drop them off along the way somewhere closer west? All of this information is important, right? What little back hole city did they live in for 8 months predominantly? Where did they set up camp? Any of those different initiatives and finding our ancestors in this movement could be a similar or a good research project, right? As we create that database that is African American, or ADOS. That was a long ass sentence. Boy, can I be long winded. Hopefully you can follow all that, and hopefully you're not one of those people who like pyramids and periods, only likes commas, and I prefer it to be standard English. Now, this could be one of those things. If they only paid them in this type of currency, then the contracts are actually in this type of currency. And so it's definitely harder to find the name of the person that you actually contracted with, even if you expect the government to hold such paperbacks. But in this case, these were the paperbacks that were printed and they were compensated through these, which also makes it even more difficult. Now, imagine this image, something like this is where that black church was. That's what it looked like before all the houses and all those other things that you see today in places like Monroe, Louisiana, or Shreveport, Louisiana. Right. So how did they get all the way to the Mississippi? And from the Mississippi, how did they get all the way to Texas? And from Texas, and which years were they a part of that journey or that movement? And was this one of the major premises as to why they were a part of that movement? Because as you remember, the Jim Crow, the harsh policing, the Klan, and all of that followed them, all the cases of discrimination, all the white supremacist terrorism that has to account for, but that is still undocumented as we can find it, or as we can claim, that shows that true legacy of, we survived it, he's just here. But it's still that civil claim, that $1 billion claim. See, if you only see a reparations check from the lens of a cup of mango slices, and then somebody else sees a reparations as niggas gonna get one mango each. Somebody else might see it as at the end of the day they'll get a mango tree, and then somebody else might say, nah, hell nah, I see more than a mango tree. Somebody says, I see a whole backyard full of mango trees, and then somebody else might say, nah, but if you really consider it, 1862 significance in 1865 even was about the 40 acres and a mule. So not just one backyard, 40 acres of mango trees is the difference in the way somebody might think. I don't think that small. I think very legitimately. And so on that Cooley Act, which is coming up, as they work their way, there were immigrants who got a lot of the love there. These Chinese, as they're talking about. And that's established in that next major piece of legislation. I'm going to finish off on the end of that last one, which is, and be it further enacted that the 55th article of the first section of the Act of 10th April 1806, Chapter 20B, and the same is hereby so amended as to read as follows. Article 55. Whoever belonging to the armies of the United States in foreign parts or in any place in the United States or their territories during rebellion against the supreme authority of the United States shall force a safeguard, shall suffer death. Damn. Death to the rebellion. That was what was stated, but as we know, they ended up actually receiving amnesty. Dig that. So that same amnesty that then allowed them to come and take those contracts, that promised land where Hilton Head even sits today. That promised land. that Sherman Reservation. So we know it to be true, but what was the actual legislation here? Check this one out. An act to prohibit the coolie trade by American citizens and American vessels. So I could go through and just read all of this, but I want to be short-winded, but I did actually provide that context and where I actually found the information. The major key takeaway for me, again, I'm a numbers and an analytic guy, is the actual enforcement. I'm also, generations of military. So shall be liable to a fine not exceeding $2,000 and be imprisoned not exceeding 1 year. So that was for the trade. So again, when you're talking about it, they're building these boats, they're building this pathway, they're using a lot of steel, so transportation, construction, a lot of that, and now they're finding labor for it. And so they essentially made a tariff or a law against the Chinese coming in and doing it. And that was supposed to be to the protection of our jobs or our ancestors' jobs from those Chinese coming in and building those railways. But there were some in America, some rebels included, and some others who decided that they can get labor from China, and they were signing those contracts and everything. And as you look at the map, it looked like it was getting that labor into California and then pushing that labor all the way to the east from California. And if that was the competition, then damn it, we deserved a hell of a lot more justice at that time, pushing back to the west. And the land would have gave us the ability to produce the food, and the food, the ability to feed our families, and the ability to feed our families, the ability to produce that additional labor that was contracted for the building of that. I mean, and they pushing out kids, even when my grandparents were having babies, they were pushing out 13 to 17 kids. And that was at a time when it was strictly just the farming. So imagine double or triple that rate based on, the religious doctrine at the time, however many wives you can support. 40 acres and a mule would have allowed for a hell of a lot of wives, thus a hell of a lot of children, and thus a hell of a lot of railroad construction teams and all of that shit. But all of that was intended in type of legislation like this. A lot of that was circumvented. And because of that, the government is complicit and therefore liable for reparations. That is the compensation claim, the standing in between fair market value of our labor and our ability to produce that. And that came through the, what we would call in our modern terms, the Department of Justice and their unfair sentencing. So as you see, they would only get 1 year. And we know people today are getting 20 football numbers for the cultivation and distribution of marijuana, or even just that end piece, the distribution of marijuana. They're getting football numbers for it. So the equivalency is just injustice at its core. So anyway, those are the major acts that I brought out from the 1860s legislation. Title is 1862 Part 1. There are also some major other pieces of elements that we could bring out as we get ready to introduce a conversation about Reconstruction. So again, this is the major legislation. Let me close that on out. Just gave you a few of the major ones, the Anti-Coolie Act. Some people might even look at that and think coolie, and it sounds familiar or rings a bell. But for me, I know the origin of it, and I know it was an act that was at the same time the protection of the African American or the American descendant of slavery at that time, a freed man, due to this different legislation that was happening at the time, and protecting the labor of said free man and the right to enter into those contracts, the different homesteads that afforded him the privilege of, a wife that's, back and taking care of a family. And then that production with 40 acres and a mule from the Sherman reservation would have then had it. So you got a space, you got land, and you have people there that you're sending your wives to, and it's multiple wives, or, that's how you build out an actual community, is the multiple wives, and each have their own tent as you can distribute that monies back and create the different dwellings and such. But anyway, all of that being just a premise. There are other acts that we'll jump into on our next live stream. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for those who are part of the live stream. Thanks for those who will join in the restream. Brother Moses, B1 Network, we deliver content. We got work to do. Peace and thanks.